If you have LEGO Star Wars The Complete Saga and you have exactly one friend willing to play it with you, you can experience everything that this game has to offer in co-op mode, allowing you to play as one character while your friend controls the other. But what if you wanted to play in co-op mode without a friend to play with? Can you beat LEGO Star Wars by controlling both players at the same time? So these are the rules. I have to control both players simultaneously using a single controller, and if either player 1 or player 2 dies at any point, I will reset the level that I'm currently playing and start from the beginning. This second rule is actually pretty important because without it, I could more or less just focus on one player and leave the other one to die constantly. And considering that LEGO games don't really punish you for dying, I would essentially be playing the majority of the game just like in single player mode. So I started my run in classic fashion with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, and every action I took was immediately carried out by both players at the same time. But not all characters in this game played exactly the same. When I switched one of my players to a protocol droid, for example, my button presses did not result in the same actions for both players anymore. This droid couldn't attack, couldn't jump, and could only walk very slowly, which significantly changed the dynamics of my gameplay. My first real obstacle was lining myself up to press 2 buttons that would allow me to finish the first level, but with no enemies around anymore, that was pretty easy to do. On Naboo, I got my first real taste at just how tough the combat in this challenge could be. I was fighting off droids quite often here, and even something as simple as collecting health items was a struggle, since I had to make sure to actually pick them up with the character that needed them as opposed to the other one. Once Jar Jar joined my party, I stumbled upon the first jump and run section in the game where I suffered my first of many deaths. So I reset the level and started making my way back to where I had died. Since both of my players would always jump at the same time, I had to position them as close to each other as possible before taking to the air. At the very end of the level, I once again died a painful death when I accidentally stabbed myself in the back. Yeah, my two characters could damage each other, which made my life much more difficult. And sadly, the Jedi were not the only ones with friendly fire. But while I could at least put some distance between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon to avoid having them beat on each other, doing the same with blasters was pretty useless since they had practically unlimited range. And with how much my players were sometimes auto-targeting each other, you'd think they had a personal agenda to make me feel extra miserable. The best I could do was separate them a bit and only shoot in parallel to them, which was obviously pretty difficult to pull off in most situations. Unfortunately, even the power-ups weren't very useful to me, because while taking them would make one of my characters invincible for 20 seconds, it would make the other one far more likely to die. Because not only were enemy blaster shots still a danger to them, but they could now also be damaged by their own shots whenever they were deflected back at them after bouncing off of my first character. I was hopeful that one blaster and one lightsaber would be a solid combo, but that brought with it its own issues as they both had vastly different fighting styles. Now thankfully I didn't have any of those issues in the pod race, which was surprisingly easy to go through. If I wanted to benefit from the speed boosters, I had to hit them with both characters at once. And this was a bit tricky to do since I couldn't easily realign them without the fear of crashing into any of the walls, but those pod racers were actually much sturdier than I had expected. The sand people got a lot of good hits into me, so I was very lucky to get some health pickups right afterward, and besides that, I managed to dodge all of the boulders, so I made it out okay. That being said, I already had a feeling that the second pod race, much later in the bonus episode, was not going to be so easy. I had a big group of characters to choose from when I returned to Naboo, and I figured out that having one of my players be R2-D2 was a really good strategy. Not only was R2 a lot slower than the others, and therefore rarely in my line of fire, but droids were also never targeted by the enemies, so that was a great way for me to kind of take a breather and be able to play almost like in single player for a few minutes. Towards the middle of the level, I ran into trouble at the spot where I had to trigger a button using young Anakin. It was not hard to make it up there, but the game automatically switched me to another character as soon as Anakin went out of frame, after which he became kind of bugged and wouldn't come back through the hatch again. This was a problem because I obviously still needed to switch to him again to press that button, so I had to somehow fly over with R2-D2, which was easier said than done because if I did that, my second player would follow in the same direction and fall to his death. I solved this issue by having that second player walk against the nearby wall as I flew R2-D2 over the pit, then hopped on over to be able to make the switch back to Annie. By standing a little closer to the edge of the chasm with my other player, I was able to keep the camera on Anakin just enough to let him trigger the button. Whenever I was playing as two Jedi, using the Force with one of them was a great way to reposition the other one, which was especially important in jump and run sections. In one of the rooms of the Darth Maul level, there were two commander droids that would keep spawning more enemies as long as they were alive, so I tried to use the strategy of constantly blocking and sliding my way forward that I had previously used in my no damage run. Essentially, whenever I was blocking and a blaster bolt was flying towards a character of mine, that character would slightly move in whichever direction I was steering in at that moment. But since my two guys were getting shot at in different intervals, trying to control them completely overwhelmed me and they eventually just fell off the stage. So instead, I tried to slice my way through the masses by using the jumping attacks, which wasn't exactly foolproof as I died a couple more times, but eventually it worked well enough to allow me to continue. The droideka part was incredibly scary to me, not because I had to fight the droideka, but because I had to then jump onto each of their platforms simultaneously. In this case, I figured out that Qui-Gon would move a little bit faster than Obi-Wan whenever I did a slow walk, which meant that I could line them up a lot easier. But I'm not sure if this was really because of the game or because of the program I had used to connect my PS4 controller to my PC, which was also what had allowed me to do this challenge in the first place, since it somehow registered my one controller as two depending on which settings I used. That program probably introduced a tiny bit of input lag or something into one of my controller slots, which might have been the reason why I was able to do this. After playing around a bit outside the level, I realized that it was always player 2 that was faster no matter which of the characters it was on, so I definitely think this wasn't an intended mechanic of the game. In case you would consider this an unfair advantage that I shouldn't have used in this challenge, I went ahead and redid the entire level without this slow walking maneuver, and instead played around with the lightsaber animations to see if they could get the job done. While figuring out this setup, I died a bunch of times, but I didn't immediately reload the level each time until I was confident enough that I could actually pull it off. So while I did suffer a bit here, it wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been. I noticed that the lightsaber animations were not always the same on both of my characters, and I used this to my advantage by slowly adjusting the distances between them. I couldn't really control which animations I got, however, so I kind of had to get lucky for my characters to move to where I needed them to be. I don't know if this difference in animations was also affected by my controller setup, but I was honestly doing the best I could here. Once I had them somewhat far enough apart, I would jump over and try for the buttons, yet the positions were never quite correct. After a lot of back and forth, I noticed that part of the reason for that was because my characters would slide off the button a bit if they weren't perfectly positioned, which would once again change the distance between them. But I could actually use this to my advantage by fine-tuning their positioning myself until I was able to successfully press both buttons. Then all I had to do was jump back and use one of the walls on the side of the room to get them closer together, and not fall to my death when jumping between the platforms. Thankfully, the Darth Maul fight was very easy and allowed me to finally put episode 1 behind me. Earlier, I had unlocked the ability to continue with whichever episode I wanted, so to switch things up a bit and to give the original trilogy a bit more love in this video, I decided to leave episodes 2 and 3 for later and instead went on with episode 4. I once again had two blaster characters at my disposal, and it almost seemed to me as if Princess Leia had even more of an auto-aim against my player 2 than any of the earlier blaster guys. But despite that, this level was quite easy, especially once I got joined by C-3PO and R2-D2, and there were even a few great moments where I got to do stuff with both characters in sync. Then I went to Tatooine, and this was the first level in which I was forced to go with the blaster and lightsaber combo. As I mentioned earlier, this was a bit tough to play as their attacks were timed so differently, but I focused on fighting primarily with Luke and simply held Kenobi's lightsaber block to make my life easier whenever I got the chance. When the droids once again joined my party, I learned that I could use my force push to knock them out for a bit, which would definitely come in handy. Getting my speeder across the quicksand was no easy feat, since I had to be careful to not accidentally kill my second player, because unfortunately I could only have one character hopping into the speeder. But since C-3PO was so slow, I made it across before he could fall to his death. My time in Mos Eisley Spaceport was not very eventful, as I mostly used C-3PO and Luke to make my way through this level. Since I didn't have to worry about shooting myself in the back, I had a pretty good time here, although there were a few moments such as the fight against the AT-STs in which I almost died. The second half, in which I only had Chewie and Han Solo, wasn't very hard either. That being said, rescuing Princess Leia on the Death Star was not nearly as easy. If you've seen my previous no damage run of this game, you might have expected the Death Star levels to once again give me a massive headache, and let me spoiler you right now, they did not disappoint. This was the first Death Star level, and in my opinion also the easier one. I had to face off against a ton of stormtroopers in here, and in very small rooms no less, so it's not unreasonable to think that I might have dealt more damage to myself than the stormtroopers did. Not to mention the fact that every time I transitioned from one area to the next, my characters were standing right next to each other again, which made it very hard for me to properly align myself before each fight. As a result, my attacks would often auto-aim at my other player when I was actually just trying to shoot some stormtroopers, which was easily one of the most annoying things in this run. I almost finished the entire level on my very first attempt, but I was awfully slow at pressing the buttons that would have released Leia, and some stormtroopers were able to take me out. So I had to redo everything from scratch, and this was unfortunately my best attempt for quite a while. After a bit, I discovered that the easiest path forward was putting on some stormtrooper helmets, skipping as many fights as I could, and carefully positioning myself whenever I did have to attack. It would have been amazing if I could have just walked through this entire level in my disguise, but the troopers in this game were able to immediately see beyond the helmet as soon as I engaged in anything productive, like pulling switches or building objects. That's how unusual it is for someone to actually do some work here. At the end, even though I was again pretty slow on pressing these buttons, I at least made sure to peek out of the door every now and then to kill any respawning stormtroopers before they could surprise me. Despite saving the princess, I was not free of the Death Star just yet, as the next level had me escaping it. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, this level was a horrible experience from start to finish. It had mostly the same challenges as the previous one, with rooms and hallways that were tight as hell, my two players shooting or punching each other more than the enemies, and so many stormtroopers all over the place. But unlike before, I had very few opportunities to take advantage of the stormtrooper helmets, and many of the rooms were quite frankly a lot more difficult to go through. What made it that much harder was the fact that I only had blaster characters at my disposal, which were perhaps the worst choice for a place like this. Now, among these four characters, Han Solo and Leia were easily my favorites. Chewbacca was the worst by far because he wasn't even capable of dodging blaster bolts, and Luke was slightly worse than Han because his double jump was a bit slower. While the princess didn't have a double jump, I could use Han Solo's to reposition myself quite effectively as long as I had enough space to do it. There was one room that was especially brutal to get through, and I died so many times there. I had to assemble some grapple points while being shot at by stormtroopers on the other side of the room, and if I didn't pull the switches next to me fast enough, enemies would also come at me from behind. Add to that the fact that I was standing on tiny platforms which hardly allowed me to do any repositioning at all, and I had a really bad time on my hands. On the off chance that I made it that far, the room with the endless stormtroopers came back to haunt me as well, as not only did I have to fight my way into the room, but I also had to survive long enough to assemble the door I had to go through to escape again. I could momentarily stop the stormtroopers from spawning by closing their two entry points, but after a few seconds the doors would once again open and I'd have to do it again. After 1 hour and 15 minutes of playing just this level alone, I was really reaching the end of my patience. So following another fruitless attempt, I decided to take a step back and try to find another way to increase my chances of succeeding. I went ahead and purchased Darth Maul from the cantina before heading back into a level that I had already completed, because this level held the power brick for the fast build extra, which I could now get by coming back here in free play, and which would hopefully help me make the Death Star and anything after that just a little bit easier. Despite playing in free play, I still had to be careful about dying, and even something as simple as switching through my characters was a bit tricky since both my players would switch at the same pace, so I couldn't even get them to have the same character character if I had wanted to. While I was at it, I also went and got the red brick for the forced grapple leap from the final level in episode 1, which would probably be useful later on in episode 3. And once I got it, I quit the level so that I didn't have to do the entire section up to Darth Maul again. Thankfully, I had just enough studs to actually purchase both of the extras, so went back to the Death Star to try again. Fast build was indeed a bit of a game changer here. It made both this room and the one with the infinite stormtroopers quite a bit easier to go through. But even after making it past all that, I still had to survive the hangar, which was stacked with even more enemies. Making it to this point in the level generally took me around 6 or 7 minutes on each attempt, so you can imagine how painful it was whenever I died there. I tried to take the hangar as slowly as possible, and once I was joined by C-3PO, that became a bit easier to do. After a full 2 hours spent in just the 2 Death Star levels, I was so glad to finally move on and instead attack the Death Star from outside. You know, I don't think I ever realized that the bomber ships could carry 5 torpedoes instead of the usual 3. Now, it's probably not unreasonable to say that this was the easiest level so far. There simply weren't that many enemies around, and while the turrets did damage me a few times, I got a lot of health pickups from any TIE fighters I destroyed along the way. I avoided any and all shots from Darth Vader by dodging constantly, and then I easily took out the turrets to open up the Death Star's weak point and officially put episode 4 behind me. This next level on Hoth must have had one of the longest intro cutscenes in the entire game, but thankfully the level itself was not that difficult. My starfighters stayed relatively close together most of the time, especially when they latched onto the same bomb or the same AT-AT, and I got plenty of heart pickups, although they were admittedly not the easiest to collect as I struggled with the perspective a bit. Inside the Hoth Rebel base, I was once again faced with the dreadful blaster only combo, but there were a lot less enemies around this time, and in the middle of the level, I got joined by C-3PO, which made my life a lot easier. There was a section where I had to get him onto a snow speeder in order to catapult him up onto slightly higher ground, but lining both players up well enough for C-3PO to actually stay on the speeder was so tricky that I simply pushed him up instead. This was about the only issue I had in this level, and that was good, because then came the asteroid field. Now, my very first attempt here was kind of amazing. It was so good that I immediately scribbled into my notes just how much easier the space levels were in this challenge compared to my no damage run a few months ago. I had a minor heart attack when I slipped into a crater before realizing that this was some kind of secret I don't think I've ever discovered before, but I got the hell out of there before anything could kill me. I got exceptionally close to finishing the level before I unfortunately died, and this was by far my best attempt for a long time. Because trying to maneuver not just 1, but 2 ships through an asteroid field was a complete disaster. I had rocks constantly banging up my ships, and I was treated to an endlessly respawning string of TIE fighters. And whenever enemies were spawning indefinitely, that was a sign for me that I'd be losing at least a handful of brain cells from how hard I would have to smash my head against the wall. As I mentioned earlier, the game was generous with giving me heart pickups in the ship levels, but when you're being attacked from all sides at once, grabbing a small heart in the vastness of space is much easier said than done, and often resulted in me just taking even more damage. I once again got so close to the end that I would have only had to shoot off 1 or 2 more torpedoes, but I stupidly let one of my ships touch the massive asteroid blocking my way, which instantly destroyed me. I used the tried and true strategy of beating up the dodge button like it owed me money, and that certainly helped a lot against the TIE fighters. If this level had had friendly fire like the ground levels did, I probably would have had to shut down the challenge right then and there, but since that wasn't the case, I eventually scraped my way through just barely before I could die again. This level alone took me close to an hour to beat, which made it very pleasant to land on Dagobah next, where I had R2-D2 for the entirety of the level, so this was pretty much just me catching my breath for a few minutes. At least, that's what I was expecting. Instead, I struggled quite a bit to press a series of buttons with R2-D2 because Luke would inevitably be forced to walk into the toxic sludge. But while this wasn't exactly easy, I was able to use Luke's double jump to reposition him whenever I needed. In the middle of the level, Luke swapped out his blaster for a lightsaber, which was actually very useful because even though Luke now had a different double jump, I could at least use his lightsaber block to effortlessly move around with R2-D2. I reached the the next big jump and run section where I needed to have R2-D2 following the lower path, while using Luke to jump along the top. My first attempt was cut short when that idiot Yoda pushed R2 down before I could even try, but this wasn't that big of a deal because I died a bunch more times here anyway. One of my main issues was actually the camera. It was really hard for me to get a sense of where exactly I needed to land, which caused me to die quite a few times. I eventually figured out that I could have R2-D2 take the upper path as well, which made this a whole lot easier. The Darth Vader fight that came afterward was really straightforward as well, so I did not have to waste a lot of time before heading to Cloud City. Now this play started off reasonably well until I reached the first fight against Darth Vader, where instead of activating a terminal to stun him, I accidentally force pushed R2-D2 off the stage. After that, I had to follow Vader through a short platforming section before fighting him for a second time, where I once again died a lot. The third battle was probably the most difficult for me, in part because I had to be really careful not to move whenever blaster bolts were flying towards Luke, since that would cause him to slide off the stage pretty quickly. On one of my earliest attempts in this level, I got past this fight with very few hearts left, and since I was afraid to face the final battle against Vader with so little health, I accidentally killed myself while searching for some health pickups. If I had just manned up and beat the force out of him, I probably could have ended the level right then and there, but instead, I remained stuck here for another 45 minutes. I was once again forced to use blasters for both of my players in the final level of episode 5, where I also learned that having a power-up on either of my guys could be really bad, because I dealt double the damage to everyone, including my second player. Boba's blaster rifle also dealt 2 hearts of damage per shot, so whenever I fought against him, I jumped around like a madman to dodge his attacks, and also make it less likely for my own guys to hit each other. At some point I got access to R2-D2 and C-3PO, which was great, since having 3PO as my second character was about as close to single player as I could get in this run. I had to use a massive magnet to transport the droids over a gap, and R2's zapper was incredibly useful here since it allowed me to have him stay still while I moved the magnet. But even with the droids, this level was pretty tough because of how long it was. Every time I died, I also had to watch the 1 minute long intro cutscene, which got annoying pretty fast. I managed to reach the final fight on the landing platform, and keeping both players alive on here posed a real challenge as plenty of stormtroopers were dropping in all around me. I had to survive until the enemies stopped spawning, so I simply tried to keep 3PO on the bridge and fought off all the stormtroopers with Lando, which ended up working out. With that, I had completed episode 5. I made my way towards Jabba's palace with only Leia and Chewbacca at hand, but I was soon joined by Luke as well, which was good since the Gamorreans in this level were the first melee enemies I encountered, and they were much easier to fight using a lightsaber. In this level I sometimes had to put on a bounty hunter helmet, which meant that I had to be careful not to blow myself up, since those helmets gave me the ability to throw bombs. Thanks to the fact that I didn't have to dodge any blasters this time around though, I made it through Jabba's palace pretty quickly. Once I had saved Han Solo, I also had to fight Jabba's Rancor, and this was by far the easiest thing I had to do in this entire challenge. I cannot say nearly the same thing about the next level though. Far from it, as this was just a terrible time for me. I had to make my way across a number of smaller ships in order to reach the big one. Enemies were shooting at me constantly from multiple directions, and they kept respawning over and over again even after I shot them with a turret. I had very little cover to speak of, and since I could also fall down on all sides of these small ships, I did not have the luxury of just leaving one of my players behind a bit while I cleared the way forward with the other one. I had to really work with both players at the same time, so naturally I died a lot. While I had a few characters to choose from, I knew that Luke had to be one of my players in this, as there were a few objects that I had to use the Force on. Although more often than not, I instead ended up accidentally using it on Lando and thereby stunning him. I met Boba Fett again, and this time he had much better chances against me. Even just making it onto his platform wasn't easy, since a short cutscene started as soon as I set foot on it with player 1, which could sometimes be pretty dangerous for my second player, since I would just lose control over him even even if it was in the middle of a jump. But even when I did make it over to Boba, taking out him and his friends was pretty brutal. In fact, I was finding it very hard to make consistent progress at all. Sure, I made it to Boba Fett every now and again and occasionally even beat him, but we're talking about 3 small platforms with a lot of levels still to come. And already I couldn't imagine how I'd possibly get through all of that. Yet another long ass intro cutscene certainly added to my misery, and at some point I decided to hop out of the level and search for some more extras that might help me out. I could have made my life a hell of a lot easier by picking up extras such as regenerating hearts, perfect deflect, or even invincibility, and you could absolutely do this challenge in this way if you wanted to, but there was no way that I'd want to do that. So instead, I focused on some of these smaller extras, which is why I went back to episode 4 to grab myself the power brick for the fast force extra, just in case it would make any difference. Eventually I did manage to get a few runs in which I defeated Boba, but right after there was a tight jump over to the main ship that held me up again, especially since I was still being shot at by the guards. I was forced to jump with both characters simultaneously, which was pretty nerve-wracking, but that became quite a bit easier once I figured out that those enemies on the main ship didn't actually respawn anymore once I had dealt with Boba. So I carefully made my way along the main ship, had to jump over a few more platforms, and once I was inside, I was joined by the droids, which was a real blessing. The only major challenge I faced after that was the disco puzzle, because I had to solve it fast enough or else it would reset. I played around with all kinds of combinations for this, and while I was really lucky to have so many characters to choose from here, I was soon considering whether or not I could even pull this off at all. I tried to solve this puzzle for a solid 10 minutes until my last 2 brain cells realized that R2-D2 Zapper was like the perfect ability for the situation. The last stretch was not nearly as difficult as the beginning, so I was finally able to put this level behind me. The next adventure seemed just as difficult because it was the speeder chase on Endor. I did not look forward to this level at all, and my fears were quickly confirmed when I crashed within like 10 seconds of getting on the speeders. Driving both of them around was not nearly as bad as I had initially expected, but it was really easy to die here since a single crash would sometimes take away all of my health. And I had to drive these speeders a total of 4 times. In between each of these sections, there were stormtroopers and AT-STs for me to fight, but they were mostly just an inconvenience rather than anything threatening. The driving segments were by far the hardest part, and making it through all 4 of them without dying was exceptionally difficult. Surviving 1 or 2 was manageable, but I struggled hard to even make it to the 3rd, let alone the final one. As I was trying to make my way through all of this, I took a day off, and when I came back, I had a phenomenal run in which I actually finished all 4 speeder sections for the first time, before stupidly slicing myself in half while fighting some stormtroopers. But even though I struggled to replicate this run, I was slowly getting better. At first, many of my deaths felt pretty random to me, but when you go through a level dozens of times, you get a really good feeling for how things actually work. In most cases, the normal trees would one-hit me if I drove directly into them, while the Lego trees would only one-hit me if I drove into them with both characters at the same time, or if I stayed in the explosion for too long. There was no single moment here on Endor that was particularly difficult, but rather plenty of opportunities for me to mess up and kill the entire attempt. So to be honest, it's quite hard for me to really put into words just how difficult this level was to beat. After 3 entire hours spent in this level alone, I decided to accept my defeat and play through it despite dying so that I could actually make it to the remaining levels. I had no doubt that finishing this level without dying was doable, but I'm afraid I simply wasn't good enough for it. Most of the AT-AT section was pretty easy by having Leia get into the walker and taking care of business with Luke, since as long as I didn't jump, Leia would remain in the AT-AT where she was entirely invincible. When she got out of the walker again, it was a bit trickier to survive, but that was no more difficult than anything else here. After struggling with the speeders for so long, it felt pretty weird to be playing a normal ground level again. I had a massive group of characters following me around here, and the intro cutscene was really long, so I was hoping that I wouldn't die too much in this one. Thanks to R2-D2, the first button puzzle was pretty easy, but I struggled considerably with the later ones as my NPC companions would sometimes take exactly those buttons that I had wanted to take. And this type of puzzle was actually the main gimmick of this level. There were plenty of buttons for me to press, and there was one section that even had infinitely respawning stormtroopers, so that was a blast. And once I'd made it pretty close to the end, I fell into what must have been the tiniest hole in the entire game. Then I was taken away to the Death Star, where I began fighting against Emperor Palpatine as Luke and Darth Vader. The Emperor was as easy as any other lightsaber fight, but the Royal Guards were surprisingly tough, and the best way I could survive against them was by using Luke's force powers before going for any attacks. The rest of the level wasn't much to write home about though, which I will always be thankful for in a challenge like this. I had initially wanted to try out a trick I had recently learned, with which you can simply push the Emperor off the map and beat the entire level in like 30 seconds, but since it didn't work for me here, I have to assume that this trick only works in free play. Then I was back in a starfighter on a mission to destroy the Death Star, and while taking out the Star Destroyers was alright, flying into the massive space station was a lot more terrifying. There were turrets shooting at me, I had to be careful not to fly into anything, and there was a constant swarm of TIE fighters trying to take me out. They dealt a scary amount of damage, but once the muscle memory from my no damage run kicked in again, I actually made it into the core of the station, where I took out the shields without much trouble and initiated the Death Star's destruction. Flying out was a mere formality at this point, as I happily cleared out episode 6 and therefore the entire original trilogy. With that out of the way, I went back to episode 2 to continue where I'd left off in the prequels. I pursued a bounty hunter through the city of Coruscant, and the only parts of this level that gave me any kind of trouble at all were the turret arenas. But even there, I had a great time by dodging constantly. Discovery on Kamino wasn't any more difficult, since a large part of it was a jump and run in which I could easily push my droid against the wall and use Kenobi's lightsaber block to jump with each character separately. Yet I still died a few times because of some really dumb mistakes. The only challenging part was the Jango fight at the end, and that was mainly because my droid kept getting blasted by the ship as I tried to dodge with Obi-Wan. But by trying to keep her off to the side, I managed to take Jango out. I felt that the droid factory on Geonosis had the potential to really mess up my day, but surprisingly, the only part that I struggled a little bit with was the first droideka, and even that one I managed to defeat on my second attempt. The rest of the jump and run sections and fights were not necessarily easy, but I must have gotten lucky because I didn't die a single time after getting past that droideka. In the Geonosis arena, there were a lot of enemies and landmines around that I had to look out for, but of course, I was blessed with the tag team of Mace Windu and R2-D2, so this level was once again a walk in the park. I had honestly expected gunship cavalry to be pretty bad as well, but by keeping my boys as close to each other as possible, it was not a big deal at all. I don't know if I had just gotten really good at playing with both characters by then, or if episode 2 was really that easy, but I was breezing through this one without many struggles at all. Now the fight against Count Dooku should have been fairly straightforward on paper, but I ran into the issue of not being able to press the buttons to actually make it to the fight, since if I got off the first one, the second one would immediately disappear again. And since both Jedi moved pretty much the same, it seemed impossible to me to only have one of them jumping up while the other remained standing on the button. However, I figured out that if I had both of my players attacking each other and then quickly pressed the jump button, there was a chance that I could keep one of them in the blocking stance by continuing to hold the attack button, while the other would just be walking and jumping around again. This made it possible for me to press these buttons one after another and continue on into the Count Dooku fight, which was incredibly easy. That concluded what was undoubtedly the easiest episode in the entire game, and we were now entering episode 3, which was the final one in the story for us. Unlike how it was in my no damage run, Battle over Coruscant was child's play in this challenge, because despite the fact that I sometimes ran a little low on hearts, I usually got some health pickups whenever I killed most enemy ships. And this time around, I didn't even have to fly into them. They were just automatically collected for me as soon as I got the kill. Saving the Chancellor was a tad bit more difficult. This droideka was in a pretty unfortunate position for me, so the best way I found to deal with it was by sending R2 R2-D2 up there by himself to stun it, and then switch over to one of the Jedi to deal the killing blow. I had a tougher time in the second Dooku fight here, as I couldn't just block and wait for all the droids to die, because I think it was not possible to block a lightsaber attack and a blaster shot at the same time, which meant I took quite a lot of damage. But going on the offensive was actually a much better strategy to take everyone out. In the section after that, I could just run all the way on the left to avoid any dangers, and the rest of the level didn't give me any problems either. I would have expected the General Grievous level to be quite challenging while controlling both characters at the same time, but surprisingly, that was not the case at all. Here I finally had a proper use for the Force Grapple Leap that I had gotten earlier, but I didn't actually need it to finish the level. Unfortunately, I had become so sure of my victory that I accidentally walked off the stage with Cody at the very last second, so I had to replay the entire thing one more time. Kashyyyk was an interesting level because Chewbacca and Yoda were two characters that I had barely used up to this point of the run. As a blaster character, Chewie was one of the worst ones I had at my disposal, mainly because he couldn't dodge any attacks, while Yoda was actually pretty useful here, since he walked super slowly whenever he had his lightsaber holstered. And having one character that was a lot slower than the other was great whenever I had to reposition myself. But since Chewie was so vulnerable, I tried to keep Yoda on the forefront here, doing most of the work with him. And this turned out to be a great strategy as I made my way through this place with little to no issues. Episode 3 was honestly just as easy as the previous one, and as such, I effortlessly made my way through the ruins of the Jedi Temple. The final level of the episode was a really fun one, and it was the one thing I had been anticipating this entire time, because this right here was the only level in the game where playing in co-op mode allowed me to do something pretty unique. The first jump and run section was great for me because every time I died, it simply reset me back to the beginning automatically, so I didn't even have to rewatch the intro cutscene. That is not to say that I died often here at all. Even when I had to make my way across a sea of lava, I just never really ran into any issues. So before I knew it, I was engaged in a fight to the death with myself. This was the only instance in the story where player 1 and player 2 were actually pitted against each other, which is part of the reason why I kept this episode for last. Obi-Wan and Anakin were engaged in a battle of the heroes, and it was quite a silly back and forth since I was obviously still controlling both guys, doing the exact same moves on both of them. In the end, Obi-Wan got his lore accurate victory, and that served as the end for episode 3 and the prequel trilogy. With that, I had completed every story level, but as you might have guessed, there was more for me to do beyond that. The bonus episode came with 6 more levels that awaited to torture me. First came the second pod race, and this was actually the original one that was in episode 1 of LEGO Star Wars the video game. It had been replaced by the easier version we saw earlier here in the Complete Saga, but the original pod race was unfortunately still included as a bonus level. I say unfortunately because this level was way harder than the new one. The pod racers controlled a little harder, although I have to admit that this way of controlling them felt a lot more satisfying to me than the new style. And it was also much easier to take damage by scraping along the walls. I died a few times by simply driving too slow, usually by getting one of my players stuck on another driver. And each time I died in this level, I wasn't sent right back to the beginning, but instead simply had to restart from the current section. Of course, I wanted to stay true to my word, so I reset the level myself upon every death of mine, although to be honest, I probably should have just went with the checkpoints on this one. The Sand People had even better accuracy this time around, and there was only a limited amount of destructible objects that could drop healing items for me, so I tried to avoid destroying them until necessary. By far the toughest obstacles in this race were the massive boulders tumbling down into the valley during the second round, because later on when they were just lying there in the round after that, I was almost guaranteed to crash into one of them. The only way I could avoid that was by having my two pod racers stay really close together, which was not easy at all. This was another level where I had to consider the possibility that I just wasn't skilled enough to make it through, and in fact I did give up after about an hour and 10 minutes. It's 100% possible to clear the pod race with 2 players and without dying, but I'm sorry to say that I just wasn't good enough. In the next bonus level I got close to dying plenty of times outside in space as I struggled to keep my ships aligned, but the inside side was a bit easier, and while I couldn't exactly relax at any given moment in this level, I did manage to barely survive everything it was throwing at me. I spent a lot of time and energy trying to get some health pickups, and luckily I always got them exactly when I needed them. The third bonus level was yet another ship level, and it was the original version of Gunship Cavalry, which in this case was an isometric scrolling level. My two players luckily got dropped in right next to each other, and while it was possible for them to become separated, the movement in this level was so limited that I didn't really have to worry about it. There was no dodging, no looping, no changing directions. All I had to do was focus on killing the enemies ahead of me and avoiding any lasers or pits. The final section was quite similar and actually even easier than the rest. Bonus level 4 was not just incredibly easy but also incredibly short. This was the only bonus level of the first LEGO Star Wars game, and I just realized that every bonus level we've just talked about had Anakin Skywalker as a playable character. Next came the legendary LEGO City level, in which I simply had to collect 1 million studs. And the only thing I had to worry about here was not accidentally strangling player 2, as I chose to play as Darth Vader. And I actually didn't have enough golden bricks to gain access to the final bonus level yet, but luckily I was able to buy a few from the cantina. You probably won't be surprised to hear that this level wasn't very difficult either, as it was mostly the same as LEGO City. Although since I was playing in co-op, there was one thing for which I actually needed to have 2 Jedi on hand, and because I only had Darth Vader with me, I couldn't complete this as I was unable to switch both of my players to him at the same time. And you won't believe it, but after resetting the level, I accidentally blew myself up as well. Now if you ask me, I would say we've officially beaten the game after finishing the bonus episode, but as usual, there was a bit more side content that I at least wanted to give a shot. Each of the 6 main episodes had 2 additional bonus levels, in which I would once again have to collect 1 million studs to win. To be honest, I don't really find these levels very interesting, so I didn't spend too much time there, but with the amount of enemies that were constantly spawning in them, they were low-key some of, if not the hardest levels in this entire challenge. And they were made even more difficult by the fact that they were set up as a competition between my 2 players. So whoever got to 1 million studs first would get the victory, which practically meant that I had to collect even more than that, as I couldn't really control which of my players would pick up the money. I did figure out that the enemies wouldn't attack me if my first player was a Sith, but this only lasted until I attacked anything, and since the studs that were just lying around didn't seem to respawn, I probably wouldn't have been able to reach 1 million studs in this way. I do think it's somehow possible to beat these challenge levels without dying, but good god, I'm not the man to do it. I genuinely don't think I would have been able to finish a single one of them. Besides that, there were also the super story challenges where I would have to play through all 6 levels of an episode back to back as fast as I could. And while we now know that it's theoretically possible to play every story level with both characters and without dying, I don't hate my life nearly enough that I would even try to put myself through this madness. The final thing I actually wanted to beat were the bounty hunter missions. And most of these were fairly straightforward, as I simply had to find a certain NPC within a level as fast as possible. In order to gain access to these missions, I had to purchase all of the bounty hunters in the game, but since I didn't have enough studs for that yet, I went and replayed Battle Over Coruscant to make some easy bank. That being said, these missions were not nearly as easy as I would have thought, mainly because all of the bounty hunters could throw bombs by pressing the button that was also used to interact with things, so I had to be really careful to not blow myself up. It also didn't help that Boba Fett and Forlom were wielding blaster rifles that dealt 2 hearts of damage to me whenever I accidentally shot myself with them. But by and large, the vast majority of these missions became significantly easier after just a few attempts, because once I knew where my targets were located, I could generally get to them in less than a minute. A few of the bounties were much tougher than others, so I had to grind into them pretty hard to survive until the end, and there was a single one that was clearly the hardest of them all, because the 14th bounty hunter mission started off in this room. And this room was unbelievably difficult to go through. I essentially had to assemble something while stormtroopers were shooting at me, then turn that something all the way through to move the bridge to the other side. This was freaking brutal to do without falling off or dying to the blaster shots, especially because the stormtroopers kept spawning indefinitely even after I killed them. Oh, and also, none of the extras worked in the bounty hunter missions, so there was no fast fast building either. Now if I had had a Jedi here in this level, we probably wouldn't even be talking about it. I would have just whipped out that lightsaber and tried to block the entire time while turning the bridge around. And while it still wouldn't have been easy, I'm confident that it would have been possible for me to somehow do it. But I didn't have a Jedi here. Everyone I had was wielding blasters. So I'm not gonna lie, this was pretty bad, especially since my patience for this challenge was already running incredibly low after everything that I had gone through in the last 20 plus hours. The best strategy I came up with was using Boba Fett to fly over the chasm, while somehow keeping my second player alive on the platform, but this was pretty difficult and it only really worked until I had to go towards the door on the right, at which point I would inevitably fall down. Now I love doing challenge runs and I generally try my best to stick to the rules I set for myself, but I hope you can forgive me when I say that in addition to the speeder showdown and the original pod race, I was unable to finish this level without dying. There's definitely some way to do it, but this was once again a level beyond what I was physically capable of doing. Except, after writing this part of the script, I actually gave this mission another shot. And I made it into the next room without having either of my guys die. Although it was only because my player 2 was somehow glitched back a bit before I could fall down. I did end up dying in the next room, but then I managed to do it again. This time even without any sort of accidental glitching. And I survived all the way to where I found Princess Leia. Which means the number of levels that I couldn't beat remains at 2, not including the mini-kit and character bonus levels. So with the bounty hunter missions finally out of the way, let's answer the question, can you beat LEGO Star Wars by controlling both characters? Absolutely. And if you're a better player than me, you can even do it without dying. If you want to help me make more videos like this, you can do so on Patreon, where I occasionally even post some behind the scenes stuff completely free for everyone, or by just liking and subscribing here on YouTube. I actually got the idea for this challenge when my controller accidentally connected to both characters while I was starting my 100% playthrough of LEGO Indiana Jones. So check that video out if you want, or go ahead and watch one of my previous challenge runs where I tried to beat LEGO Star Wars without taking damage. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.